Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the School of Continuing Education, to the SCE Community Lecture Series. I'm very, very pleased to see you all. Ahlan wa sahlan, sharaftuna. I hope, and I'm sure you will enjoy today's lecture. And I'm so happy to see such a number of people attending a lecture on philosophy. You know, I remember, I'm a teacher, I'm an English language teacher, and I know students, especially students in Thanawi Amma, they hate philosophy, especially because in secondary, they're forced to take philosophy, and it is a dreaded subject. And many students go to the science because they don't want to study philosophy. And I discovered myself and my son, philosophy is part of life. It is a way of life. And of course, we have one of our top professors at AUC. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Rob Switzer. His name is Robert, but I always call him Rob, and he's known at AUC as Dr. Rob. Dr. Switzer is my friend. We've known each other a long time because he loves Egypt, and he's been here many, many years. Now, he is a double dean. He was dean of the undergraduate studies and the Academy of Liberal Arts. This is where all the students start their first year experience there. And now he is another dean. He is the interim dean of his own school as a philosophy professor. He is the dean of the Humanities and Social Sciences School. We call it HUS. So it is my honor to also introduce I don't want to read his bio because I'm sure you can read it. It is very long. He is highly published. He's written a lot of work in, I don't really understand, of course, and please forgive me, Dr. Switzer, all the different research studies and chapters and books you've written about philosophy. I mean, there was Nietzsche, for example, things I can't pronounce, but very impressive. And one last thing I want to say on a personal level, Dr. Switzer taught my son. My son, Basil, took 2 courses in philosophy, and Basil was changed. And I'm very proud of my son because Basil is able to think deeply and thoughtfully, as Dr. Switzer does. Dr. Switzer is a very thoughtful and very deep academic and friend. And when I go to him, and I learn a lot, life lessons from him. And so I'm very honored that you have accepted the invitation to come and talk to us today. And I'm really looking forward to this, as you are, I'm sure. So can you welcome me to enjoy to welcoming Dr. Switzer? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Barai, for that very, or Dina, as we know each other, for that very, very nice introduction. And yes, it's true. That's really my first point. Philosophy has a bad reputation. It has a reputation on one side of being really, really complicated and hard to understand. And it can be, it's true, sometimes. And on the other hand, of being just completely useless and irrelevant. So it's not a very good combination. Now, on the first hand, I'm always remember what my mother told me. My mother, God rest her soul, always said to me, especially when I was a grad student studying philosophy, if you can't explain it to your mother, you don't know what you're talking about. And I've always tried to live up to that. And I think my students over the years have actually complimented me a great deal by saying that I really try to make things understandable. I try to explain things well, even, these very complicated things that we philosophers get up to. And because I really do think it's important. And that corrects the second hand, which is that it's irrelevant and useless and has nothing to do with anything. I firmly believe it does. And that's the whole point of this discussion today is to connect it to a genre, a group of books, especially in movies and all sorts of things in the media today that are incredibly popular, and people take them seriously, and I don't mean to say that they shouldn't be, but they're not as good as philosophy, I'm going to try to argue. And that's the whole self-help thing. Now, this really came home to me a long time ago when I was a student in Toronto. We had something that just opened in, say, 1980 or the late 70s. Yes, I'm old. And in fact, you'll even know that more when I tell you what opened. The world's biggest bookstore. Now, it's hard to imagine that anyone would care about any bookstore. I mean, bookstores are not... Actually, there's some beautiful bookstores in Cairo that are not that old, so I shouldn't say that. But no one's bragging about the world's biggest bookstore anymore. Amazon is the world's biggest bookstore, and it's online, and everything has moved online. But this was a time when that didn't exist, and they opened this incredible bookstore. And so I went in there, and it was really a fun place to browse. You know, you could find books that they were sort of clearing for very little, and they were interesting things. But I was a student of philosophy, so I asked the nice salesperson, where's the philosophy section? He looked at me with some embarrassment and sort of laughed, and he took me over to this little area that was about this long in a shelf, and they had a couple of books there. And he was really embarrassed because he said, you know, I'm a philosophy major. I'm telling them they need to get more books in philosophy. So we had a whole conversation about how people don't appreciate philosophy. But the thing is, I looked up and I saw the big sign that said self-help. And it wasn't just a shelf, it was an aisle. No, it wasn't just an aisle, it was 4 aisles, 5 aisles. It went on and on. There were endless books on how to live your life, how to be a better person, how to find meaning, which is what philosophy is all about. So it seems like this business of philosophy has been taken over by a whole group of people that are making a lot of money, and the philosophers are, as you'll see, we're always poor, and that's fine. I think the thing is, though, that it's important to step back and see where all this stuff comes from, and it does have a history. I mean, what we want is to find, well, actually, if you want to know what they're about, let me read you some of the Amazon's bestsellers in self-help. Wholeness, winning in life from the inside out. From dark to light, a modern mystic's guide for healing the shadow and embracing the light. So these are themes we're going to come back to, the idea of the light, the idea of the wholeness, or finding this whole that we're part of. Here's another one, The Angry Therapist, a guide to finding and living your own truth. Well, you know, philosophers don't like the idea that everyone has their own truth. So sort of the truth should be something that's, you know, that we're seeking, we're all seeking. But anyway, Breaking Normal, not rewind, I meant that wrong. It's rewild. You got to become wild again. Rewild your inner self and set the truth free. Okay, here's another one, Pounding the Stones, 7 lessons in developing grit on the path to mastery. Grit is sort of like that, you know, stick-to-itiveness. You have a lot of grit. Magnetic Love. Stop chasing what you want. Start attracting it. Okay. And finally, I mean, I could go, there's thousands of them, but The Undercover Edge. Find your hidden strengths, learn to adapt, and build the confidence to win life's game. Okay, so I mean, you get the idea. And in fact, I want to start with a book that I particularly like. Oh, sorry? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. I went to the... By the way, I'm going ahead a little too quickly, but these are actually the 3 books titles that I have. This one, I've read all 3 of these books that I'm showing the covers of, and I didn't read any of the ones I just mentioned. This one was a huge bestseller. And the title says what the book's about, you know, that is that men and women are different. Okay, well, you know. And then it says how they're different. Well, women are different and men are different because of the way that what they want. When a woman comes home from her job and says that the guy next to me or the person next to me in my workspace is really irritating and all the noises he makes crinkling up paper and everything else, her husband says, why don't you move your desk? And she just kind of looks at him, and then she goes on and on about this awful guy. And according to the book, women just want to talk about their feelings, and men want to get solutions. So you go through 100 and 200 pages, and that's all it says. And I just saved you about 400, 500, 600 pounds because there's nothing else there. And honestly, the fact is that I know a lot of men who like to vent their feelings and don't want solutions, and a lot of women who just cut through and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. So I don't even think it's true what they're saying, but like a lot of generalizations, it maybe has some, and maybe it'll help, as they say, to you improving communication and getting what you need in your relationship, or whatever want or need or whatever. Anyway, that's good. All right. Another one that I also read, I was about 12 years old. This was a wonderful self-help book. I'm okay, you're okay. And it does sort of solve the problem of life, right? That so often people come around and they want to make you feel like you're not okay. Or maybe you don't feel you're okay. And so this analysis tries to sort that out, and we should all be happy together. It was the 70s, so this was a big thing then. The thing about this book is also it's based on a psychological movement. I don't think it's around too much anymore, but it had three different parts of the soul. It had the parent, it had the child, and it had the adult. So each of us has within ourselves these three different aspects. And then it did this analysis of the way we interact with people, so that sometimes I want to be the child, and I want you to be the parent. I want to be bad, and you have to tell me I'm being bad, right? And I'm forcing you to play the role of the parent, and maybe you don't want to. And I'm playing the role of the bad little child. And you do, it is interesting. People do play these kind of roles. And what we want, of course, is that I should be an adult and you should be an adult, and I'm okay and you're okay, and now the world's a better place. So I remember this book after all those years. It couldn't have been too bad. But this book is the grandfather of the self-help movement, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It was originally published in 1936, and if you go to Amazon, it is still a top seller. And in fact, there's a new version that just recently came out. I'm sorry, I don't know why this is happening to me. In the digital age. So now we have a whole new approach to how to win friends and influence people, which again is the road to success. But these books are all about how to. They're all about how to live your life, how to be successful as a human being. And they sort of act as though, of course, in order to make money, they have to have a very brand new take on things. They have to have new ideas that no one's ever thought of before. And they also have to, of course, be accessible and popular in the way they do it. Actually, I have a cousin, my American cousin. I'm Canadian, by the way. My cousin is a little older than me and grew up in the United States. And it really is different, the Canadians and the Americans in my family. This guy was a businessman, an entrepreneur, and he made a lot of money working for the Dale Carnegie Institute, giving courses and programs on the Dale Carnegie approach. And there's an industry that's out there around this whole approach to life. I don't think you'll find that with some of the people I'm going to mention. There's no Aristotle Institute. Although there is a kind of Platonic institute, and it's called the university. And so maybe that's unfair. Maybe those people have had some influence. All right, so my question pictorially is, what are we searching for? Obviously, we feel that the world and ourselves, there's something a bit of like a maze. There's a mystery there that we're trying to find the path to truth, to enlightenment, to inner peace, to living with others successfully. And we're a little bit lost. If only we could stand up and look down and we could see the way forward. What we want is ideas, insight, self-discovery, right? The light bulb going off. And that's what these books promise. Okay. This guy was born in about 480 BC, 470 something. So 2,400 years ago. And he passed away, in a way I'll get to, in 399 BC. So and he's often considered the father of philosophy. Socrates is an interesting guy. He didn't write anything. Now, he was married. His wife Xanthippe may have told him to get some eggs at the market, and maybe he wrote a shopping list. I'm not saying he couldn't write anything, but he didn't write any philosophy. There's nothing that survives as far as we know. He said, I have nothing to say. I don't want to teach you my wisdom. He lived a very simple life. He was a very brave soldier when he was called upon to go to the fight in the military. He really was outstanding. And he was a good citizen in every way, but he was very strange and often irritating. And there you see another bust of Socrates. He looks pretty weird. And he was notoriously, he was not a handsome guy, and he was notoriously just bizarre. He was a short little fat guy that was running around with no shoes. And that was a time when, they had sandals. He just chose not to wear shoes in the marketplace. And he would come up to people and start asking them questions and so on. His thing was searching for the truth. He was dedicated to that his entire life. One time apparently someone said, "Oh, Socrates, I went and I asked, the soothsayer, who's the wisest person?" And they said, "You." And the person thought it was really funny, right? Socrates is wise. And Socrates didn't laugh. He said, "Well, I can see why they'd say that. But my only wisdom is that I know nothing. And I know that I know nothing." Most people think they know. Most people think they have knowledge when they really don't. And of course, that's very dangerous. To think that you know what you're doing, to think that you understand a situation, and you really don't, is a disaster. So Socrates said, "I have a great advantage over most people. I know that I know nothing." And when you realize you have this lack, then you want to learn. You have a desire to learn. And in fact, the word philosophy means the love of wisdom. Philos is a kind of love, and Sophia, which is also a beautiful woman's name, but it actually in Greek means wisdom. So philosophia is the love of wisdom, and that's what Socrates represented, the desire to know, beginning with the recognition that we don't know. So he said he spent his life after that looking for the wise man, the wise person. So he would go up to people who appeared to be wise. They would pontificate about all the things that they knew, and this and that. This just, for example, there would be some discussion and they would say, "This is unjust." And Socrates would say, "Oh, well, you must know what justice is." So he would start asking questions. And in that questioning, he was on a quest. Those two words are related. You're on a quest, a journey, a search, and that's what questioning is all about. Another image of Socrates, he looks a little more quizzical there. He's questioning. So what is justice? He asks this question. This is actually something that his student Plato captured in a book called The Republic. Socrates was invited to a rich man's house, and they start having a conversation. And there's a character who says, all this stuff about justice. By the way, Plato doesn't appear in this. He wrote these things, but he never himself appeared in them, and he used Socrates as a kind of character. But in the early dialogues, as they're called, Socrates is pretty accurate to what he was like in real life. In the later dialogues, the later works of Plato, it was more of a made-up character, and it was giving Plato's own views. But in this point, the issue comes up. What is justice? And the first answer, or at least one of the answers that comes up, is very sensible. Returning to someone what belongs to them, what is owed to them. I mean, if you were to borrow somebody's car, and then they said, by the way, can I have my car back? You needed it just for the weekend, right? I need it back. And you were to say, no, it's my car. I mean, the person would say, that's not just, that's unfair. We had a deal here, that's my car, you're stealing from me. It's a fairly clear example. Now, there could be cases where giving someone back their car is not a good idea. If they're incapable of driving it safely, maybe you shouldn't give it back to them. A clearer example of that would be a weapon. Now, these are the Greek weapons, so you'd say you borrow that or that. But it might be simpler to imagine in our present day, let's say you borrow that from somebody. In any case, before I go to the next one, the story basically would be this. Socrates actually tells the story as an example. He says, well, let's suppose your neighbor lends you this weapon, and then you hear this neighbor getting into a huge fight, and very, very upset, and in fact, enraged beyond the point of sanity, and screaming, "I will kill you," to someone. And then they knock on your door and they try to calm down and say, "Oh, excuse me, that weapon that I lent you, can I have that back just for a minute?" They're going to take this weapon and kill someone. If you return them their property, you will be involved in murder. So is that just? It's their weapon, their gun, their sword, but obviously it's not right. So Socrates clears that answer off the table by giving a counterexample. He does the same thing with this next answer, which is treating everybody equally. That sounds like what justice is all about. When I was a little kid, I was very upset that my older brother always got literally a bigger piece of the pie. It seemed like that to me anyway, and that's not fair. I should get the same, even though I might have been 4 years old and he was 8 or 9, I don't care. I want the same. Now, that's the issue, though. What if it's somebody who is not just like my brother and me, but what if it's someone who is perhaps like this nice old lady here, and on the other hand, this gentleman who probably eats a little bit more, or maybe this gentleman who probably eats a lot, and I wouldn't want to get between him and dinner, frankly. I'm sure that he consumes a lot more than that nice old lady. So do you give them the same amount of food? Is that justice? Everyone gets the same? Do you make the old lady lift the weights the old guy that this guy lifts? I don't think so. So the point being, again, that justice is not just giving everybody the same. It depends a lot on different issues. So that definition, because a definition, like you don't say the definition of a circle and then say, by the way, that's only true on Monday. On Tuesday, a circle looks like this. No. A definition of a circle or a square, that's universal, always, it's absolute. That's what we're looking for, the truth. So you can't just turn around and have something that works some of the time. Now, my point in all this, though, is that Socrates, as you can see, is kind of irritating in that he asks questions that are very hard to answer. And the other thing is he didn't give answers himself. He just kept asking questions. And people finally got fed up with him. They brought charges, these young revolutionaries. I guess you could say that in Athens in the 400 BC, there was a little bit of a swing to the right, like we're seeing in places like Europe and maybe Trumpism and places like that. People were tired of all this liberal, whining about things, and they wanted order, and they didn't like people asking too many questions. So Socrates got in trouble. They charged him with innovating and coming up with new ideas, even though he never offered any ideas. And they charged him with corrupting the youth. Now, he did, by the way, come up with one idea. He said that whenever he was about to do something bad, he would hear this voice. And they, of course, thought he was making up new I don't know what, where's this coming from? But it's obviously actually what we would call the conscience. When you hear this person inside telling you, don't do that, it's wrong. No one had ever tried to identify that until Socrates did, and they were puzzled by that. But the biggest thing is that he was seen as corrupting young people because they were following his example. What we really don't want is young people asking questions. At least if you're, if you want everything to be orderly and everyone to listen to you. Of course, universities are where we bring young people and encourage them to ask questions. And in fact, society needs that. But at the same time, it is seen as somewhat dangerous. In 400 BC, they got rid of this guy. He's found guilty, he was put to death. But there were a few people that followed his example and started taking it very seriously, but they were scared. They had to be careful not to let it happen to them. So they started asking questions like, what is justice, or how am I to live my life? And they tried to provide answers. And one of those is Plato. Plato is, we don't have a lot of good pictures of Plato, a lot of good busts, but although you can't tell here, he was actually a very handsome young man at the time, in his late 20s, rich family, well-connected, with a bright future ahead of him in business or whatever, threw it all away to follow this crazy guy Socrates. Now, he didn't go to the marketplace and do philosophy with just everybody. He took his young students out into an area outside of Athens where there was a lot of trees and shade. It was known as academia. It's the academy. And that's why I say that when the university is really the Plato Institute, it's because Plato really started the university. And then his student, Aristotle, who I'll get to in a minute, he divided up knowledge in all the ways that we still divide knowledge up today. So these two, Plato and Aristotle, created the modern structure of higher learning, of universities, and everything we do is really following in their footsteps. But I don't think they get royalties. Anyways, so he needed safety, and he needed also to protect himself. So he didn't publish his lectures or his treatises. He wrote things, but they've been lost. We don't know what he may have written in that regard. But he also wrote these dialogues in which they're like little plays. And there's a character named Socrates. There's never a character named Plato. The author never appears. But he used Socrates and then other people, and they have dialogues, discussions. And it's following the way Socrates actually did things in his life, questions and answers. And they led to a kind of crisis where people got very angry often because they didn't know the answer and they were frustrated. But that, according to Socrates and Plato, is the key moment when you know you don't know, and you can then discover the truth. The thing that guided him is the thing that Socrates said: the unexamined life is not worth living. He said this at his trial. And the trial is the one document that we know must be accurate because Plato published it at the time. And this is an accurate picture of what Socrates actually said at his trial. And he basically said, look, if you tell me to stop examining and searching for the truth, it's like you're telling me to stop being human. I can't do that any more than, a lion can stop being a lion or a sheep can stop being a sheep, right? A human being examines and thinks and pursues the truth. That's what makes us human. And that's what I want to live my life doing. And if you tell me to stop, you may as well kill me, which they said, okay, and they did. So anyways, I don't know, so forgive me for this flipping forward. So I want to talk just briefly about the fact that universities, and AUC in particular, is dedicated to something that we call the liberal arts. Again, this all goes back to the Greeks and Plato and Aristotle and so on. People know that AUC believes in the liberal arts, and that's what we're known for. But people, what does it mean? Well, when I ask my students over the many years I've been here, the idea of freedom comes up, but not necessarily exactly in this sense, to free the mind. But that's what it really is about, to free the mind. And then this idea from the chains of unexamined assumptions. Well, what exactly does that mean? But if you're free, if you need to be freed, you must be in chains. So what is it that's chaining us? One of the most likely things are the things that we think we know but we don't. The assumptions that we make, the things that we build on and that we take for granted, but which actually may not be true. And of course, many people believe they know what a good life is all about. If you say, what's a good life? They say, oh, sitting on the beach at a luxury resort, having all the money in the world. That's what's so great about all those stories about the jinn, the genies giving all these wishes and people discovering that, no, I didn't really want that. So anyway, it's an age-old issue about what do we really want in life? So we need to examine our assumptions. Now, I want to give you a brain teaser. And I think this is, again, I was 12 years old when I saw this too. A lot happened to me when I was 12 years old. I was watching TV and this thing came on and I tried to solve it and it just made no sense and it was not solvable. And then, they came back and they gave the solution. And it's stuck with me all these years. Okay, well, what is it? Connect the dots. You have to draw 4 lines, and you cannot take your pen off the paper. You can't back up over one of the lines. You have to draw a line, and then another line, another line, another line, and you have to connect up all the 9 dots. Now, it sounds easy, but if you had a piece of paper, you could try it, and you would realize that it's not, actually. And then the issue is, why not? What's making this so hard to solve? So there you have the 9 dots, and there, let's say we draw a line. Now, we connect the dots, right? So then you're going to draw another line, maybe to the right. And if you do that and then up and around, you missed a dot. How are you going to get all 9 dots with only 4 lines? Well, the assumption that we make, when you look at those dots, what do you see? You don't just see 9 dots. Yeah, it's a square with a dot in the middle, right? And that's our nature. We see a square. We see a wall that separates the inside of the box from the outside of the box. And we don't want to go beyond the box, right? It's like there's an unwritten rule that says you cannot go outside the box. Now, you've heard the phrase, think outside the box. Well, here's the box. And this is where we have to go, outside the box. right? And it's scary out there because it's like, you can't do that. It's like you're in outer space. There's no air. There's nothing to stand on. That just can't be allowed. But it is allowed, actually, and it's the only way to solve the puzzle. Voila. You have to actually see it not as a box, but I don't know, like a pointer, an arrowhead or something. It's a flock of birds. It's not a box. It's just that we see it as a box. And that's what I mean by unexamined assumptions. We take things and we give them order, we make sense of the world, and that's fine. But the things that we do to make sense of the world, the way that we do that, gets in the way of finding the truth. And our job is to wake up to the restrictions that we ourselves put on the way we see the world so we can actually find the truth and live a better life. So there you go, 4 lines connecting all 9 dots. So back to Plato and the freeing of the mind from the chains of unexamined assumptions. Plato is famous for a lot of things. But I think the thing he's most famous for is a story that I think everybody should know. And I make sure I tell my students this story. It's actually a very small part, a few pages in a very long dialogue that he wrote called The Republic. It's the same dialogue that starts off with the discussion of justice. And in fact, the whole dialogue, and it has 9 books, is about justice and how to achieve it in the self and in society. But in the middle of this, for reasons that I'll come back to, though they're not as important as the story, he starts to describe a situation, and it's clear that he's talking about us. We are these prisoners that are sitting in these chairs in a cave, and we're in chains, and the chains are set up somehow. We're bound in such a way that we cannot even move our heads. We can only stare straight ahead. And we listen to sounds and we see something in front of us, but we are not allowed to look around and find out what's going on. And of course, we don't even want to, because as you'll see, what Plato's actually describing is a lot like going to see a movie in a cinema. And how many people in the middle of a cinema want to start looking around? No, you're completely engrossed with what's on the screen. And of course, what's on the screen is light, shadows. And that's exactly what Plato describes. Now, okay, so here's this shadowy tree that they're looking at, and there's a reason I said tree. Here's the situation that if let's say one of them breaks out of the chains and turns around and gets out of the seat, this is what that person would see. That there's the prisoners and there's the wall of the cave. The tree is being projected onto the wall. The light is coming from the way far back. There's a fire. Now, of course, they didn't have projectors, right? So he had to invent it. He had a fire casting shadows. And in fact, there's somebody walking on a parapet carrying statues. And in this case, it's the statue of a tree. Okay, so there's the fire and the statue, and then there's the shadow being thrown onto the cave wall of this tree, let's say. And then there's a little statue, a little shadow of a bird flying into the tree or whatever. Now, obviously, it's just like a movie theater. You can imagine this could be very elaborate. One of the things Plato never even talks about is who's back there with the statues? Who's in control of these images that we take to be reality? Now, 20 years ago, there was a movie called The Matrix that was sort of just like this, right? That we're living in this virtual reality, and it's really not true at all. It's just a projection. And there's been many science fiction stories that have touched on that theme. But this is 2,400 years ago. And this guy came up with this idea that the world that we live in, that we take to be so real, is actually an illusion. It's not real. And in fact, but he doesn't just mean the things we sense, but the things that we know, the things that we believe, the shared reality. It's a projection. And what we need to do is to free ourselves from these chains and make our way through, by the way, there's a secret passage there. You can make your way up to the surface. And one of the things that I think, again, Plato doesn't discuss this, but it's sort of part of the story of Socrates and his courage, is that, once you found the cave and the light, the fire, wouldn't you be happy with that? You've learned a lot. But this person, this seeker after the truth, this philosopher, actually goes into the darkness of the tunnel and believes that there's something higher and continues up until they finally make it to the surface. where there's a real tree. And Plato likes to go on about the difference between the shadow of a tree, the statue of a tree, which is like three-dimensional, and then the real tree. And that's his view about the world we live in. We see the shadows of ideas, whereas what our goal is to see the pure truths in themselves. And in fact, he goes further. Because when you get to this real world, you not only see the tree, but up there above the tree is the sun. It's the light of the sun that makes it possible to see. And in fact, Plato went further than that, and modern astrophysics would agree with him. The sun, or suns, created the earth. Like everything that is ultimately came out of a sun, an exploding sun. All matter that we know was formed inside stars. And so, but Plato, he didn't elaborate this. He just said that the sun is the source of the being of what is, the existence of everything, and also the light that allows us to see and to know the truth. Now, many people have thought, what is this sun? And obviously over the centuries, religious people have said it's God that he's describing. But whatever it is, it's obviously the ultimate source of truth and existence, and the goal in life is to break free in the darkness of the illusion that we live in and to find the way to the light of truth. It's a really powerful story, and it's influenced all of us, whether we know it or not. And certainly a lot of the greatest philosophers and thinkers and storytellers over all these centuries have been influenced by this amazing story. And I'm sure that, probably Plato stole it from someone else. We'll never know, but in any case, a great story. And it really does set the the essence of his philosophy as a story of achieving this kind of truth. But actually, he goes on when he tells his story, and he talks about what happens when this person goes back down into the cave. Because, even though they've achieved everything that all of us want, well, let me tell you something. When he describes this sun that's the source of being and truth, he gives it a name, and he calls it the good. And once you've seen the good, you can't ignore the people in the cave. Right? You know that you have an obligation to help those people. So you go back into the cave, into the darkness. And what are these prisoners going to think of you? What are they going to see when you come stumbling back into the cave, your eyes dazzled with the light of truth? They're going to see this. They're going to see this idiot with his eyes dazzled, right? He's mumbling or bumbling around and so on. So no wonder they killed Socrates. He's a troublemaker. He's going on about the truth, and what is that anyway? So it is actually an explanation of why they killed Socrates for Plato. Socrates was someone who, maybe he hadn't seen the truth, but he got further than most of us. And that's something that the prisoners didn't want. And that's the real issue, right? How do we reach the prisoners? How do we reach each other and begin that process of turning away from illusion and turning towards the truth? And to try to do that, Plato wrote these dialogues, and they're very good at being both accessible, and the more you read them, the more depth that you see. It's not an encouraging story that they killed Socrates, but Plato tried to find a new road for philosophy. And, the issue is that obviously the cave is not just a place of darkness, but of evil, of corruption, right? It would kill someone like Socrates. So how do we make this world better? I mean, if we can't bring everybody out of the cave, and that's the ultimate goal, how can we make the world and people as they are better? And that was the real purpose of his book, The Republic, because in it he described this ideal state. It's not an ideal state. The ideal state would be a state of everyone is perfectly enlightened. And it's a realistic state, because it says that most people are not. And how do you help them? And actually, part of the book seems a little bit authoritarian. He's not a Democrat. And a lot of people have debated whether he's serious about some of these ideas or just making a point. But we don't need to get into all that. The point is that he did give an answer about justice. And he started by talking about the soul. And that's strange, but he went into what we might now call psychology. And he said that the soul has three parts. At the lowest level is desire. Everyone's filled with desire, we know that. At the next highest level, there's this controlling element within us that acts like a kind of inner police force And you'll see the connection there. And he called it the spirited element. It's the part in us that when you see something wrong, you get angry. You want to stop it, right? And if you're a moral person, you feel this kind of anger when people, if someone pushes an old lady in the street, you just want to go over and, hit them and yell at them. I mean, this is terrible. How can you treat an old lady like that? That is the spirited element. And then the spirited element helps to keep the desires in check. But the guiding force is reason. And that is what makes us truly human. So he has this idea that there's 3 different parts of the soul. And then he says, first I should say, there's this guy named Freud. He had kind of stole his ideas, right? The ego, the id, his desire, and then the superego. So if you want a quick sort of easy thing, and remember parent, adult, child, right? So the adult is is reason, is the ego, and the parent is the superego, or the spirited element, and the child, desire and the id. It's very, very similar in each case. But he turns to the city, and he says that the city is the same structure as the soul. It's the same thing, just writ larger. So if you want to look at the individual soul, and that's what he says he's interested in, so we can become just human beings, let's look at the way the city is set up. And the city also, he says, he describes this whole arrangement where you have 3 different groups. The huge majority of people are just the people, the everyday people. And they're dominated by desire. They want to make money, they want to live well, and that's fine. But then you have to have a police force, he says, the guardians, to keep order and to protect the wealth that the city generates from enemies, other cities and things like that. But then you have to have the rulers. And these rulers are a famous phrase of his, philosopher kings. So I'll take the job. But it's an interesting idea, isn't it? When it's been tried, Plato himself actually went to southern Italy during his lifetime and thought that this tyrant would put him in charge. He barely made it out with his life. It did not go well. So there's a bit of a theory and practice issue between the philosopher kings and things actually working out. But in any case, he thought that the people that rule should have a vision of the truth, that these should be people like that. And of course, over the centuries, there's been many arrangements, particularly religious leaders who say that they have divine knowledge and they take political power. So that's not completely unusual, and Plato was one of the first people to say that the ruler shouldn't be the person that has the most weapons, but the person that has the wisdom to rule. Kind of a novel idea when he said it. This is a very famous painting that Raphael, it's actually in the Vatican in Rome if you want to go see it. It's a very large painting. So all of these people are philosophers as portrayed by the artist Raphael in about 1400 AD. That is to say, he depicted them as looking like his friends. And 2 of his friends, Leonardo and Michelangelo. So those were the people that he took as the models for these 2 central philosophers. Plato's on the left and Aristotle's on the right. This is the way Raphael imagined them. Now, the issue isn't I don't think Plato actually looked like Leonardo da Vinci, and that's who that's a portrait of. But the issue is actually the way they're standing. Plato is looking like this, up, pointing to the heavens. And Aristotle is, no, it's here, right? He's pointing to the reality around us. And there's no, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture's worth 100,000 words. It sums it up beautifully, the difference between Plato and his star pupil, Aristotle. Plato believed in the forms and the truth beyond this world, and Aristotle wanted to explore nature and the world around us and the way humans actually live and try to find the truth in this world. He was much more of a scientist. He loved nature, and he was less metaphysical, although he wrote a book called Metaphysics, along with all those other books that he wrote. Pretty macho guy, right? I mean, what a guy. That's actually Aristotle, a bust from the time that he lived. And so he was a very energetic thinker, and as I said, we owe him a lot. The thing about Aristotle, I could go, obviously he wrote, I don't know how many books and hundreds of thousands of words, so it's hard to summarize. But the two things that really matter to our quest is that he focused on virtue. He didn't focus on becoming a good person by knowing the absolute truth through this journey of enlightenment. He just said, we know what it is. Look around. What makes a person a good person? Now, virtue in English today is connected to, is she virtuous? That's a very narrow sense that we owe to the Victorians. The word virtue for the Greeks just means excellence. An excellent human being. How should you live your life? And you develop these virtues, and I'll show you in a minute some of the ones he talked about. And the point of it is that you don't do it for any reason other than to be excellent. And it's like his view is, the Greek view that he picked up on, is that a person has a purpose, just like a tool has a purpose. If you have a really beautiful, a racehorse has a purpose, whatever it is, or a really special knife that you use in your work, or a scalpel that a surgeon might use. And it's a very precision tool, and you want to use it for the purpose that it's intended. If you get that tool and start using it to open a can or paint or something, you're destroying something that's valuable. So if we take our qualities and use them for evil, we're basically doing the same thing to ourselves. We're taking something that's intrinsically valuable and destroying it, right? So how can you do that? How can you live with yourself knowing that you've debased yourself that way in the pursuit of what? Money or something? He didn't get it, and it was a really powerful account of virtue. The other thing is the golden mean, which is finding the right balance. And a good knife has balance. A good tool always has balance. So what is the balance for the virtues of a human being? Obviously, that's kind of a lot of information maybe, but the clearest example is the first one. You can have too much courage. The word for too much courage that's up there is rashness. Don't be rash, right? But it's like a soldier who's rash. There's the enemy, and they run in and start attacking the enemy. Well, that's a good way to get killed. Courage doesn't mean that you have to just attack always. Courage has the wisdom to hold back and take the battle at the right moment and be victorious. But courage doesn't mean, of course, being cowardly. So you can have too little and you're a coward. You can have too much and you're rash. The thing is to have the right amount. And then he gives these other examples, and in fact, there's a whole bunch of them that he goes through. You see, they're not just what we would call moral virtues. They're just virtues that make a person a good person. One of them is generosity. You can be like really tight and cheap, or you can just be vulgar and give too much away and make a real show, or you can find the right balance. And the one of the things that he believed in is up there. The word is magnanimity, but it's a translation of the Greek word that means greatness of soul. And that's a good idea, right? We should be great. We should try to achieve a certain element of greatness, but not at the expense of other people, not too much and not too little. So it's a very interesting analysis. Of course, if we had more time, it would be fun to go into it, but I just wanted to give you a little taste. And I want to skip a few centuries, like about 12, 13, 14 and a bit, maybe 15 centuries. Obviously, this is not a portrait of Ibn Tufayl, but it's something I found on the internet just as a visual. Ibn Tufayl wrote a really interesting book, again, a sort of novel, like the Republic is kind of a novel. His novel is called Hay bin Yakuson, and translation is something like Alive, Son of a Were. And this is about a person. Some of you may know this book, but it is very interesting. It's about someone. Imagine someone who's brought up without the influence of human culture. So he gives a couple of different stories about how this person, this baby, may have gotten to the island. The reason he gives a couple of stories, I guess, partly is because it doesn't really matter. The important thing is it's a story, and this baby is there and is raised by a deer, and there's no humans. And this young baby grows into a man and has no exposure to human culture. And the story that he tells is how even without any other people around, this person would find a way to ascend towards truth and knowledge. Looking at nature, looking at the stars, looking at the world, and looking mostly within himself, he finds the truth. And at the end of the story, he meets Absol, who teaches him language, first of all, because he has no language, and then teaches him about civilization. And it's a very interesting account how he feels there's a lot of similarities and a lot of things that he's not sure about when it comes to human civilization. But the point is that he starts off not in a community of prisoners, but by himself. And that transition is very important to where we are today. We are, in the world, some places more than others, focused on the individual, not on the community. And so we begin in the cave by ourselves, and it's like, we're, right? Instead of being in a movie theater now, we're at home watching on our home, video screen, or in front of our computer, or in front of our phones. And we're actually, even though we say Facebook connects us, we're actually more and more isolated. And so this journey of trying to find the truth begins within the self. Now, I have a lot here, and I'm just going to go quickly through some of this. He finds his way to the light, and that's, I knew I wouldn't have much time with Ibn Tufayl. I'm not going to say too much about this guy. His name is René Descartes. The thing about Descartes is that he follows also that idea of the individual. And I think, therefore I am, is his favorite, his famous slogan. I am, I know I exist. And then he discovers God exists because I have this idea, it must come from somewhere. So it's like the theater of his mind again. And then why does he want to do this? His obsession is science. Just like Socrates' death influenced Plato, Galileo was almost put to death, and it influenced Descartes. And Descartes wanted to preserve science and establish science and not get killed. And he said, I'll make a nice connection with religion, everyone will be happy. But in terms of his ethics, he just do what everyone else does. He had nothing to say about ethics at all. And the point is that, again, he's isolated and alone, and he doesn't seem to really care about, his self-help is like Newton sitting under a tree, getting hit by the apple. And notice he's reading Descartes. And it's all about science. It's all about finding science. The technological world is dominating our world today. We often say that there's a split between science and values. One of the great thinkers of that was Emanuel Khan, who was the late 1700s. And he spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. And he basically said, we need the two sides. We can't be completely technological and dedicated to abstract truth. We also need our intuitions, our connection to the world. As he said in another place, science is organized knowledge, wisdom is organized life. And the key then is, he brought us back to that ethical search. And he was, in his own way, very, very religious, but also very committed to an ethics of treating other people with respect. Not too long after him, about 100 years, I guess, comes this guy. And I like him because he's really is a self-help thinker. If you were to sum up his philosophy, it would be a slogan like, say yes to life. And his criticism of the history of mankind is that there's so much negative control and anti-life philosophy. And even Plato, right? And all this idea that the truth is up there. Aristotle had it more correct. The truth is here. We're living people. We need to live our lives and live them fully. And what Aristotle said that I should have mentioned, people talk today in self-help about human potential and realizing your potential. That's Aristotle. He said everything has a purpose. You need to find your purpose and realize it. And Nietzsche, 2,300 years later, is saying the same thing. Skip the first quote. It doesn't really matter. You can read it if you want. But the second quote I like a lot because we have a lot of tourists in Egypt and, they trudge around the pyramids. He saw them in the Swiss Alps climbing the mountain. And we're so focused on the goal, right? We're just dragging ourselves to the top of the mountain so we can see the view. And his point is, look around. At every step, there's a magnificent view, and each one is unique. It's a very simple self-help message, right? Wake up and smell the flowers and be in this world right now, and don't be focused on some distant goal, but in this moment right now. And he was one of the first people to say this kind of stuff so brilliantly. Another guy, Kierkegaard, around the same time, unlike Nietzsche, very, very religious. He was dedicated to the idea of making a choice, of making a decision, in his case, ultimately for faith. And it's not an easy decision. He said to people like Descartes, who tried to prove that God exists, no, you're missing the point. Faith means you believe in something that you don't have enough evidence to believe in. You throw yourself into it, you commit yourself fully into it, and that's the moment of faith. And this last quote, at some point you've got to get serious about your life. I don't think that's Kierkegaard. That's the guy who taught me Kierkegaard. I can still picture him. He had these heavy eyebrows and he glowered at us and he told us as students, you've got to get serious about your life. And we all quaked. And it was a true Kierkegaardian moment. And so, yes, right? At some point you have to be serious about your life. And the two of them, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, go well together. Just really quickly, this guy you may have heard of, Jean-Paul Sartre. He passed away in the 1980s, and he was most famous after World War II. And he also was an atheist, more than Nietzsche, actually, far more. He was really a devoted atheist, but his philosophy is, in a way, owes a lot to Kierkegaard. One of the things he said is, everything's been figured out except one thing, how to live. That's still true. And then he said, basically, he focused on freedom and responsibility. And everything you do, you have to take responsibility for. You are your choices. It's what you make of yourself. So, again, doesn't this sound like self-help? It's this very powerful message of taking responsibility for yourself and trying to realize your own potential. We are our choices. So, again, don't have the excuse. My favorite story, the reason I included Sartre here, is because he fought for the resistance in France against the Nazi occupation, which meant, he risked his life for freedom. And he had a friend who said, oh, I wish I could be like you, Jean-Paul. I want to fight for France, but I am a coward. And Jean-Paul said, mais no, Pierre, you are not, right? You choose to be a coward. And tomorrow you will choose to be a hero. And that's really the message, I think, that we don't have to be trapped by this idea that we are something set in stone, but we can recreate ourselves by our choices and become the person that we want to be, which was the title of my talk, Become Who You Are. Find your true self. This is a picture that has Sartre in the background, Gilles Deleuze, and Michel Foucault. And in the end of his life, Michel Foucault wrote a book called The Care of the Self. So philosophers are still interested. But going back to Nietzsche, Nietzsche, again, the thing I like about him is that he was an artist and obsessed with art. And he saw each of us as living a life that should be seen as a work of art, right? So that he didn't just say, make choices, but he said, make the choices that an artist would make. And one of the things that he said about artists is that sometimes they make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but the artist makes the mistake look like it had to be there. It becomes part of the artwork. And that's for him the secret of a good life. Yes, things go wrong. Things happen to you that you didn't want to happen, you didn't expect to happen, but you have to overcome that. And you have to make it part of this work of art that contains and includes these strange colorations and darkness and everything, but it's part of the overall beauty of the work of art. And he talked a lot about that in various ways, but it really comes down to, like I said, to say yes to life. Don't be a slave to the people in the cave. Be your own master. Life is masterwork. It's your work of art, that you are the creator of your life, and so on. And those are the themes that he has. And it is very empowering. And it's a nice theme, though, again, that we don't want to be the slaves of some dark forces in the background, but we want to free ourselves from that. I think the idea of self-mastery and overcoming the human instincts is particularly appropriate as we're getting close to the holy month of Ramadan, when it's all about being a human being and overcoming thirst and hunger and so on. And I think that's a very powerful image that is that sense of self-overcoming that is such a strong theme in all of these philosophers. But I wanted to end with Socrates because it's the thing that guides all of the philosophers in their thinking. The one thing that we can say is that to turn away from thinking and to turn away from asking questions is not to live the good life. It's an easy and maybe comforting thing to do, and we all do it. We lose ourselves in gaming or entertainment or whatever it is. But we have to get serious about our lives at some point, and we have to wake up to this fundamental call that we look seriously at ourselves and the world around us and begin that journey towards the truth. And that's really what philosophy has to say from the beginning to the end. It's a fundamental message. We may not have the answer, but we know that we have one answer, and that is you have to search. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to have questions. Yes, absolutely. I don't think I can say no, can I?
Okay. Thank you very much for this interesting session. I do have lots of questions, by the way. First of all, how do you see the curve from which Socrates started? Let's talk firstly about literary criticism, because this is my major, and I'd like to, at the very beginning when I decided to take this, this was because of Socrates, Plato, and so on. But nowadays I see that criticism is taking completely different path, and it's somehow urging people to think in the same way, to the extent that we do have certain expressions and terms, terminology, from different critics, but they end up in the same way. This is the first question. May I ask my questions at once? Okay. Second, what do you think of the definition of justice? Because this is the first time for me to think in it in this way. What do you think, or how do you consider the definition of the word justice? Because what you elaborated really made me think in a different way about this word. The third one is concerned with hypnotophile. In fact, I studied this one before and I had made my research. I read it in Arabic, and it was in comparison to Robinson Crusoe. But believe me that there is a completely different translated version than the original one. I noticed here that the title has been translated as being the son of a werewolf. Although in fact it's the son of a wig, and I see that there is completely different meanings concerning the connotations, because this novel mainly it was written in the 11th century, as far as I remember, and it has completely different message. I think that it's the son of a wig because it showed how a person who had been born and found himself on his own has reached his way to God, that there is a God. And afterwards, when he discovered that there are people who are living somewhere else, and he went to them in order to tell them that there is a God, and to tell them his discovery, he found that they are completely indulged in their materialistic lives. And this is the difference between awake and aware. Aware may be considered, as you just mentioned, to be aware of the truth. But the son of awake, because he is not that much indulged like the rest of the people in materialistic preferences. What else? These are the three questions that I remember.
Three is good.
Okay, thank you very much for this.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I completely accept your reading. I cannot claim that I read the book in Arabic first, and translations are notoriously problematic. I think that partly maybe my memory actually of putting it down wrong, but I think what you're saying is, I think the issue is that I wanted to mention something that was drawn from Islamic philosophy and something that indicated that this search for the self, for the truth, and so on is definitely universal. It's not Western philosophy as European philosophy. The Europeans, everything that we know as European philosophy owes everything to Cairo and Andalus, to the people that were thinking and writing 1,000 years ago in this part of the world and in the Islamic world in general. They're the people that found the texts of Plato and Aristotle, thought about them, contemplated them, related them to their religious experience, and passed that on to the people 500 years later in Paris and so on, that then led to everything else. So, it's not like this is, this is a story that is a worldwide story. It certainly includes Egypt and what we think of as... In fact, Plato talks a lot about ancient Egypt and how it's really the source for his own thinking in many ways too. So that's something we don't know much about. Anyway, so I'll just accept your view on that. On the second issue, on justice, well, that's, it's a huge question, and there have been some answers from philosophers. I think John Rawls is probably the most important one who talks about how you actually achieve justice in practice, and his basic thing is you imagine, instead of the world as it is, imagine that it was just being set up and you didn't know what role you'd have in it. That's just a wonderful, simple idea. You don't know what role you're going to play. Are you going to be poor? You're going to be rich? And so you want to set up a system in the world that kind of has equal opportunity as much as possible. And that's, he calls it the originary position or the original position. Anyway, but Plato's not interested in that so much as he's interested in, the individual examples of justice. Finding justice is really about, in a sense, what's in your heart. It's more about who you are as someone who's devoted to justice. So he ends up actually saying that justice is like being properly tuned. The state must be properly tuned and the soul. So it's like a musical thing. Justice is having the elements that I mentioned in their proper harmony. And the idea that to create harmony in the state, you have to have harmony in the soul as much as possible is again, a very powerful idea. The question, of course, is what do we tune to? When you have a piano tuner come, they have this tuning fork who claim to know the truth. So what you instead get in the rise of totalitarianism is people that, it's like you have Plato's Republic. You have the rulers, and they're going to impose order for the good of society, but they don't even claim to know what the good is. Power, in its own sake, has replaced a vision of the good. And that's what totalitarianism is, that's what fascism is, in my opinion. So it's a dangerous tendency that there is to not even care anymore about the truth. People say we live in a post-truth age. That's a very dangerous thing, I think. The idea that, I say that I had more people at my inauguration than anyone in history, so it must be true. That's just the thin edge of a very bad direction. So anyway, I think that the idea of questioning assumptions, even if it's frustrating because there don't seem to be any single final answers, it still has an incredible value. And it has that value today as much as at any time in history.
Dr. Switzer? I'm here, at the back, yeah. I don't know why Theodore Adorno has crossed my mind during the lecture, and I'd like to know how you think of him in terms of self-help. Thank you.
Well, I don't know if were you at the conference? We had a conference in this very room on the International Adorno Conference, and it was very exciting. There was quite scholars from all over the world that were here. Well, a lot of them seem to be from Canada, actually. I don't know if they were from all over the world or not. But anyways, there were some really nice papers on Adorno. I think Adorno is someone who's trying to continue that tradition that I mentioned in Marx, of a very strong critique of society. One of the things that he believed in very strongly was that, was that we need to eliminate suffering. And that's, I think, an example of something that is really important to talk about. And I didn't bring this up with any of the Adorno scholars, but suffering, would it be actually a good thing to get rid of suffering? I like Nietzsche. Nietzsche talks about this. And I think when he looks at our age, the problem that he has with it is that we've gotten rid of too much suffering. Everyone is very comfortable. We go from air-conditioned car to air-conditioned shopping mall, and everything is the same. Are you ever in a shopping mall and you don't know what country you're in? It's the same everywhere. And, individual differences, social differences, what makes this country is being lost in this flattening out. And everyone, it's a good thing that there are fewer people suffering in poverty today, despite the huge number of people, but certainly the percentage is lower, I've read, than any time in history. I mean, we really are making progress towards eliminating a lot of suffering. We're getting rid of diseases. And we're doing a lot of things that are very good. But at the same time, the idea of getting rid of suffering, Sweden, which is a totally egalitarian state, everyone is very well off, has the highest suicide rate in the world. People, maybe it's the darkness, I don't know, but people, they find their life is meaningless. We need something to struggle against, arguably. So anyway, that's just something, that was sort of a takeaway from one of the things at the Adorno conference. But the fact is, he's a very, very powerful thinker. I like his attitude towards art very much, and that art, good art, is not something, well, like a lot of people like Mozart because it makes you feel kind of happy and you can, good background music. Adorno likes art like modern art that is jarring, that is maybe even painful, like the modern music that has all these bings and bops and you're like, wow, you enjoy that? Well, the reason that Adorno thinks his art is really important is because it shakes us out of our complacency. When you go to the shopping mall, there's this muzak that's universal kind of background music, the same seasonal appropriate tunes played everywhere in the world. This stuff is jarring and it wakes us up. And he thinks that art has a very special role in doing and as Nietzsche did as well, in doing what I described as, freeing the mind from the chains of unexamined assumptions. When you think about Plato's story, he never tells us how the prisoner first got free, And that's one of the great things. I mean, we're sitting there, each of us watching this movie that is the world in front of us, around us, and we're all engrossed in it, and the technology is making it more engrossing all the time. We're gaming and social media and, all these things where we don't even realize where we are. So we're lost in this world of illusion. What shakes us out of that? And one answer is maybe great art. Another answer might be just beauty. Another answer might be just the other person, like love. Whatever it is, there's something that breaks out of the world of illusion, and that's the thing that we need to identify and find in our lives. That for many of us, it's just a moment, unfortunately, and then we fall back into the everyday. But I think that what we'd like is to have that moment last and turn it into a journey towards really becoming a better person. But the key thing is, how does it start? And I think that's what we're thrown back to. And again, I think Adorno is very much in that tradition when he tries to address that, and in the name of social justice, which, again, is exactly what we need to think about. So thank you. That's a very good question. I don't know, Dina, if we're getting near the end of our
I think we are.
time.
And,
I'm getting a little, you guys have put me to the test. You've asked me some very, very good questions. I appreciate it.
we really thank you. I learned a lot. Thank you, Rob, for coming and doing this talk, for giving the talk for us. And thank you. We want to thank you for that. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank all of you. Did